Okay, one more video to go a little deeper into a couple of themes that I think are important to remind ourselves of for our final project. As we've seen, the final project is an ambitious design. It may be a little complex. We're going to take a lot of time in designing it. It's going to be a rich design in some way. So I want, though, in the course of designing it, to remind ourselves of some of the themes from the beginning of the semester and that have been emphasized throughout, but that really bear repeating. And the first is, as you're designing your piece, probably it's going to have some realistic, things from real life in it. It may have figures, people in it, or buildings, and whatever it may have. But we want to remind ourselves to think abstractly even while we're designing these, real things. So we from the beginning we've talked about this idea that art that is effective, designs that are effective, a big part of why they are is because even when they're showing something real, that real thing has been broken down into shapes, broken down into its essential elements in a sort of abstract way. So you think all the way back to our first assignment where we broke an image down into polygonal shapes. You don't have to use only polygonal shapes in this, but that same kind of thinking where you were analyzing things as shapes, thinking abstractly, that is a key idea. And then also the idea of simplification, capitalize this, employing intelligent simplification. So as you're working to, if you have a piece where you've got some scene, really think about what is important in that scene. When we say that this piece is going to be complex, that doesn't mean that it's got to have a million little random things in it, right? Every element of your piece should be there for a good reason. So you should, if you're doing something that has a realistic aspect to it, that refers to real things, then you also want to be really deciding which of those aspects is really important. And just throughout, I think it's important to remember the idea that oftentimes doing something very realistically in this context is just going to be hard, right? We're dealing with a design that isn't that big, flat colors. It's hard. So oftentimes, kind of coming up with a compelling stylization for things, coming up with a sort of abstractified treatment of the real thing, is often better than trying to make it quote unquote totally realistic. So let's look at some examples of this. All right. So, very simple image here. This is not, these images that we're looking at right now are not examples of final projects. They're images that I found that I think demonstrate some principles well. But just looking at this, obviously we have a real thing, right? We have a camper van RV thing in a landscape. But notice that as those two principles mentioned just a moment ago, they are really it's a simplification, right? It's you can really see that the artist thought about, okay, what's really important in this scene, and what seems to be really important in this scene are these simple planes of color, this simple swooping shape for that mountain range. But see how effective that is, that single curve, then with that secondary curve on top that gives a little sense of light coming over that hillside. Simple in terms of the numbers of shapes and the intricacy of them. A couple of simple swooping shapes, but boy, is that a thoughtful version of simplicity. Boy, are those shapes truly crafted to perfection with great deliberateness and care. And look at the way that that this vehicle has been portrayed too, right? It's made entirely out of verticals and horizontals mostly, but with these rounded corners. It's sort of like that, like the iPhone kind of thing of like rectangular forms that are rounded on the corners. The way that it's all that detail, you could have looked at that if you had been looking at pictures of a camper van you were trying to see all the different details and trying to draw the different details. Like, no. See how just a few key elements have been selected such that the focus can really be on the overall form of that van. A focus can also be on the light, the dramatic light, the way that the person decided, I'm going to just put this side of the van in complete shadow, completely dark. And the boldness of that choice is really effective, right? So as we go through our designs, as we develop things that may be fairly complex in certain ways, you want to keep in mind that simplicity and also that sense of designing things in terms of abstract forms. You can really see the way, like look for example, the way that the top of that van is just straight across. It's almost, it violates perspective a little bit, but there's a certain satisfaction to the simplicity of the way this line is just perfectly straight across. These are perfect verticals with these rounded corners. There's a real emphasis on a kind of simple stylization that has a very powerful effect. More examples we can look at. Other landscape approaches where there's some kind of stylization rules almost that are taken. So like mostly polygonal with a few key curves allowed. Actually, no, just this one curve, isn't it? That's the only curve in the piece. And if you're doing figures, I think it's especially important to really think about stylization options. So let's look at this figure here. So I think that it's really commendable the way in this picture, we really can see the idea of using, taking your geometrical approach, your abstract approach to doing a figure, because doing a figure that looks as real like a photograph, that's just impossible, right? So in these designs, it's important to kind of think about what is going to work well with the tools that we are using, with this sort of visual language of flat colors and shapes and simple shapes. Not that this is simple. This is a very complex design if we really look at all the different elements here working together. It's made out of these geometrical shapes like triangles and ovals and simple forms, but it still has a ton of personality. It still has a lot of realism too. I mean, the way that shadow falls underneath the chin. But what I really think it's almost like you have to kind of create a set of rules as you're going, like, okay, I'm going to kind of use this particular flavor of shapes to make my picture, and I'll make it look as realistic as I can using this limited vocabulary of shapes. And that gives you a kind of a style that feels very unified. Again, these are not actual designs from pieces, but these, I think, really show these principles at work. This next one is very complex, but I think is neat to see. Another version of, is it realistic or is it abstract? Well, it's both, right? Because we have this figure that is designed a little bit along the lines of the posterized portrait, right? Where we have these different chunks of color representing lights and darks zones within the figure. But they're also really abstracted in a way. Notice there's this emphasis on, you can almost feel underneath this, a grid, right? You've got a lot of emphasis on these lines going in a crisscrossing way. Imagine a grid turned 45 degrees. A lot of these angles are all parallel with one another, forming square edges when they meet. So even though this has this realistic quality, there's this kind of abstract structure that it's built on top of that kind of locks everything together and makes everything feel very connected and very unified design-wise. And there's many different effects that one can go for, and different kind of flavors that an abstract approach to designing something realistic-ish can have. Here's one that's this kind of fun, folky theme, and most of these are of course made on computers, so there's a certain complexity and intricacy that is difficult to achieve, but not impossible with our paints. And this kind of more light-hearted form where there's some funny, like, look at this perspective thing here, right? Like, obviously the way that this tilts, this top shelf tilts compared to the bottom, that doesn't make any perspective sense, right? but it has its own charm to it too, right? Because we can see that that's a conscious decision. It's a very dramatic, conscious decision made by this artist to create a fun, kind of lighthearted, folksy feeling to the image. And we can see that it's intentional also because there's so much about it that's just been designed with such care in terms of the scale of these little tiny feet, those precise little foot shapes. Um, there's plenty to show that this is not just an accident, but a deliberate style choice. This image here, I think, is these figures hugging is neat because I think it also shows the abstract relationships between these things. Notice how the way this like imagine the person behind, the blonde-haired person, is wearing a reddish shirt, but then the red shirt, they're hugging this person in the front, but then their short sleeve ends exactly at the moment along the edge of this shirt of the figure that's the darker haired figure here. That's not realistic, right? But it makes good abstract sense, right? So you have the sense of these things, choices being made for reasons of abstract satisfaction rather than having to be quote unquote real at every second. The way these lines all meet at this point here, the way the hairlines happen to meet at this exact point, there's no realistic reason for them to have to do that. It just feels good abstractly to have those things merge. The way this head, the way the hair meets exactly at this edge. All of those little decisions to make things kind of interlock create unity to the design, create a sort of abstract satisfaction to the design. Another more, oops, sorry, my scrolling is a little wacky here. Oh, darn. Well, okay, I have to change this. So another example of a quite complex scene. It's always when people are working on a design and they've got a complex scene and they've got different characters and different things going on, I always get a little nervous, right? Because that can easily just look like a jumble of stuff, and then if you don't kind of do a thorough job of painting everything, it can just look like a mess, right? And this is a very complex design. Again, this is done on the computer, so a lot of it's more possible to get obviously the exactitude and than when you're wrestling with the paints. So obviously we're working with you're probably not going to do anything that has like this many figures and quite this level of elaborateness necessarily. Although some of us might get something approaching it. But what I want to highlight about it is, again, the way there is a style created based upon abstract shape. So we notice that this design is entirely based on circles and long, basically circles stretched in different directions to create long forms. We trace around these figures. It's a single language that unites everything. And there's, again, emphasis on certain angles being parallel, like the way her arm is perfectly parallel with her leg. The way this is a 45 degree that turns right here. Again, you really can see very clearly in this one, I think, the way there's like almost like a rule, a principle that the artist decided on. I'm going to make this picture entirely using circles and extended line, long shapes from circles. You can see that got really carried through to bring together all these figures. And I think it's a lot better than if the person just said, well, I'm just going to try to do all these figures as realistically as possible, because that wouldn't have that tight design, that tight feeling of a design that's really unified. So that's my talk, just to review on those ideas. As you're designing, if you've got real things, think about how you can stylize your real things to create an abstractly satisfying kind of image. Try to do smart simplifications in the process that get at the most essential characteristics of what you're trying to show us to get the maximum effect, and not have it be stuffed full of little details that don't really add that much. Right? Okay, that'll do. Thanks.